Campaigns Director at Results Canada. I'm based in Ottawa, which is on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. If you're not familiar with Results Canada, we're an advocacy organization committed to creating the political will to end extreme poverty. We do that by combining education and action. So we educate ourselves, our volunteers, and decision makers on the most effective ways to combat poverty, and then we put that education into action. So we use the power of advocacy to push for policies and funding decisions that are going to have the biggest impact in the world. We have volunteers based across Canada, so I can see some familiar faces already, and happy to have you on the webinar. And we also have a national staff here in Ottawa, so you might see some of them as well in the titles, and you'll meet many of our volunteers and staff over the next month or so as we present to you this Advocacy Bootcamp. So I'd just like to pass over to introduce to my colleagues and co-organizers at OCIC.
Fantastic. Thank you, Taryn, and welcome once again, everyone. It's so nice to see so many familiar names and a lot of new ones as well. My name is Eugenio Choa. I'm OCIC's, the Ontario Council for International Cooperation's Community Engagement Specialist. And I work out of Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. If you're new to OCIC, or this is the first time you interact with us, we are a network of over 100 organizations, institutions, and individuals working in sustainable development. So doing a range of work between trying to achieve zero poverty, to gender equality, to climate justice. And one of our programs that you'll meet some of the participants today is our Youth Policymakers Hub. And really the inception of this was came out of the need to resource youth and others in the network with the skills to be advocates and to be policymakers. And so this partnership with Results Canada has been in the works for a while, and we're quite excited that it's come to fruition in this way. And in this way in terms of a series. So welcome all. I'm very happy that you'll be able to meet our community and also the Results Canada community. My colleagues Elisa and Isabel are here. You'll be able to see them and interact with them in the throughout the series as well. Back to you, Taryn.
Perfect. Just getting the slide to move. There we go. Okay, so the fun part of webinars, just a little bit of housekeeping. Just so you all know, this webinar is going to be recorded and we're going to send it to all of you. We're also going to send you the PowerPoint that you're going to see today, as well as a worksheet with some bonus content, including some top tips from our advocacy team, some questions to reflect on, some resources that you might find helpful. I would suggest that you do check your junk mail, because I know sometimes mass communications like this can go in the junk mail. So just give that a check. And if you don't receive it, feel free to reach out. The most important thing that many of us have learned on taking countless Zoom calls over the past month or so has been just make sure to mute yourself unless speaking. If you have any questions, technical questions, we have Eliza from OCIC who can help you, so you can always message her directly in the chat box. If you don't know how to do that, just put the question in the chat box and she'll get back to you. We're going to have designated question and answer periods, so a couple throughout the session. So you can either use the raise hand icon if you would like to speak, or just put your questions in the chat box and we'll monitor them. If you can't find the raise hand icon, that's fine. You can just wave your hands frantically and one of us will look for you and make sure that we get to answer your question. We do suggest, if you're able to turn the video on. One of the things we're trying to do with this boot camp session and this advocacy workshop is make it as interactive as possible. So it's really nice to see faces, but recognizing that sometimes internet bandwidth doesn't always cooperate, and that this is also over lunch. So if you need to eat, feel free to turn your video off. So welcome to Advocacy 101. This is the first of our series of advocacy sessions that we're so excited to bring to you. Many of you have already registered for the future sessions, but just the way that it's set up, you do have to register for each session and can do that on Eventbrite. The way that this workshop is designed is that the sessions will build on each other. So what you learn today, you'll get to dive more in depth into the future sessions, but they also, if you have to miss one, don't stress out. We can still send you the content and you're not going to be left behind. So what is our goal of the workshop? What we're hoping to do is just leave you, one, with the clearest understanding of what advocacy is and why it's necessary in achieving social change. We want to share with you a collection of advocacy tactics and methods that could be applied to moving your own work forward, but also to give you the confidence to actually do so. And finally, what we're really trying to do is create a community of practice that you can continue to learn from, give and receive support. We really want this workshop to kind of go beyond just the next month we have with you guys, and that you really kind of build up some connections and learn a lot. So we're very excited about this. As part of the community on as part of our goal on building a community of practice, we are going to kick off with a let's get to know each other. We're then going to follow with a little bit of a what is advocacy, followed by a Q&A. We're going to then focus why advocacy, why is this something where we think is so important to bring to you. So we have a really exciting lineup of guest speakers that are going to come, a case study with Executive Director Chris Dendys, as well as some expert testimonials from some really fantastic advocates, including Rochelle, Amanda, and Libby, who are going to speak to you guys, followed by another Q&A, and then a quiz and a wrap up, a very non-stressful quiz, so don't worry. Sure. So I just want to talk for a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts on what advocacy is. I know many of you have experience in advocacy, so some of this might be old to you, some of it might be new to you. Hopefully you'll get kind of some good tips out of it and force you to think about things a little bit differently maybe. So in a very, starting from the bottom, what is advocacy? At Results, we're constantly trying to figure out how we communicate what advocacy is, because it's not a word that's often familiar to people. But what it does mean is it's about conducting actions to influence decision makers and to bring about specific changes. So that's advocacy in a nutshell. It's very wide encompassing. We talk about creating change. It can be at the local level. It can be at the community level, the national, the regional, the global. Many of you are here today because you're interested in the Sustainable Development Goals and how you advocate around international development. But I think the skills that you learn through advocacy can be applicable through all kind of walks of your life, even just at the individual level and what you do to create change. Advocacy, when it's done right, can spur action. It can play a role in holding governments to account, and it can also ultimately push political agendas forward. Advocacy is sometimes defined as and thought of as speaking up for or on behalf of marginalized groups or people who otherwise can't. And I think that's something important for us to reflect on, especially for those that are advocating around global development issues, is that we have a responsibility, if we want to be good advocates, and not just speaking up for people, but elevating those voices and making sure that the people that we advocate on behalf of are also part of the process and heard as well. So that they are part of the change that you're ultimately trying to create. This is a quote that I'm sure many of you have heard. It's just a really good one around advocacy about never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And I think that speaks to a lot of the ethos of Results and what we try to do there. A couple months ago, there's a few of us that went and met with an MP, and she had a throw pillow that was embroidered with this quote. So I think it's a pretty popular and important one. So one of the things that I find can be a little bit confusing about advocacy is, what is the difference between advocacy, lobbying, activism? What do all these things mean? How do I choose what I want to engage in? Which one do I use? So the way that I think about it is advocacy is kind of an all-encompassing term about pushing decision makers to make changes. Lobbying is a tactic, is within advocacy, and many of us lobby as we do at Results Canada, but it's very specifically about influencing legislation. So if you work, and I know many of you do from the introduction, work for different organizations or charities, there are specific rules around what you can do when you're influencing legislation. We have a Lobby Commissioner of Canada, they regulate that. If you're interested in learning more about the lobbying aspect of advocacy, in our parliamentary session, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But actually the people at the Lobbying Commissioner of Canada are very responsive, and they have a great website. Activism and advocacy. Sometimes they're pitted against each other. You might have heard that advocacy is making change from the inside, whereas activism is making change from the outside. I think they're both very connected. You need both in order for change to happen. At Results, we do both. A lot of our focus is on insider advocacy. So it's building up those relationships with decision makers and educating and showing them the way that they can make the decisions that are going to have the best impact on the world. But activism absolutely has its place. Sometimes decisions are made because of outside influences. So if, for example, this picture is from the climate change rally, which is a great example of where activism, lobbying, advocacy all coalesce together to show the government that this was an issue that Canadians care about and they need to do more. So kind of marching in the streets, doing stunts on Parliament Hill, things that might seem typically activisty, all have their role in advocacy, I think, too. And there's no limit to the tactics that you can take in doing these. I would say that the ability of people in different groups to engage in these activities are varied, and that's something to remember. You know, we can take for granted that we're very lucky, Canada, that we do have relatively easy access to decision makers compared to many other countries, and that advocacy and building those relationships can be a little bit easier. Being an activist in many places can actually be very dangerous, and it can, we have colleagues, we're part of a global health partnership of advocacy organizations around the world, and in many countries, including, you know, India and others, advocacy and activism is not necessarily the safe space that it is here in Canada, and even for certain groups in Canada it isn't. So that's just something to remember, that when you're engaging in it. So why do we do advocacy? What are some of the outcomes? When you do good advocacy, you can increase the visibility of your issue. You can gain media coverage, which might translate into new allies and champions. And we use the term champions of somebody that's supportive of your issue and is speaking up on it. It can even elicit attitudinal or belief change, creating the political will that can ultimately result in increased funding, changes to laws, regulations, policies, and plans. These are all, there's many secondary and primary impacts of advocacy. One of the things that you'll see and that you'll learn through these workshops is that you might have an ultimate kind of goal of what you're trying to accomplish in advocacy, but there'll be many add-on factors and outcomes that'll come, and a lot of them will be good, and we need to celebrate kind of those wins along the way to what your ultimate success is in the end. Sometimes I like to think of advocacy as kind of creating a supportive environment for the decision that you want to happen. So that's when things like media coverage and raising the visibility and getting new champions can help with. So next week, we're going to focus on this in more detail. So I'm not going to go super into depth on this, but honestly, these 9 steps that I have here, if you ever want to build an advocacy strategy, you can just go through them and it'll really be helpful. And I use this, and we use this at Results Canada. These are kind of the building blocks of an advocacy strategy. You can build a really complicated advocacy strategy at Results. We build big ones, but these can also be translatable if you just want to take action at home or in your community. You don't need to overcomplicate it, but they all have kind of the same elements. So the first thing you want to do is identify an issue that you care about. This is sometimes, you can think of this, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? Then you want to educate yourself. So this is something that we do a lot of at Results. What are sometimes, you know, you think you know the problem, and then you dig a little deeper, and there'll be a lot of systemic issues that contribute to that problem. So you want to make sure that you're well educated on the issue, that you're speaking to the experts that know about it, that you're consulting with the people that are going to be impacted by the issue, that you do your research. That can even just be hooking up with an organization that's well respected in that space, or a colleague or an academic or whoever that knows well about it. Next, you want to identify the targets and stakeholders. So there's a couple tools that we'll share with you that you can use to do this. There's power mapping, stakeholder mapping. So what that means is who has influence over the issue or the problem that you're trying to solve. The influence, so targets would be who has influence over that, and then stakeholders are going to be who is impacted by that. You then want to set SMART goals and objectives. So what are you trying to accomplish? What is the thing that you're asking people to do, your targets, that's going to have the biggest impact? At Results Canada, we talk about something those you might be familiar with, which is the trim tab. So my boss is going to be very happy that I'm raising this because she loves the trim tab. But the trim tab is the small piece at the front of a boat that's not very big at all, but it steers the boat. So by shifting the direction of the trim tab, you're able to shift the direction of a huge thing. So the idea is that sometimes a very small action or ask can help to create massive change. And that's a thing in social justice that you might have heard before, but it actually is impactful in the terms of what your ask will be. After you've done that, and I'll explain a little bit more, you develop an advocacy strategy. learning more about that next week. That will include creating compelling key messages. As you guys all know, if you're on social media or watching the news, there's so many things coming at us daily, a lot of information overload. How can you explain what you're trying to accomplish in the most compelling way possible and for which audience? Following that, it's important to build a movement. So bringing supporters and allies in. This is one of the things we do a lot at Results Canada is if you care about something, I guarantee that somebody else out there cares about it. And it's about finding them and leveraging your resources so that you can create more impact together and have more legitimacy the more people that you bring into the fold. This one is not the most exciting of all the steps, but I think it's really important, and we're going to do a session on it, is the monitoring and evaluating your progress. Sometimes with advocacy, it's not as straightforward to monitor and evaluate success. If you've worked for, another organization where you implement projects, it can be a little more straightforward, perhaps. So say, I'm going to dig a well, the well is dug, people get access to water. Advocacy sometimes can be a little more nebulous in how you measure that impact. And it's a really important thing that you're thinking about at the beginning of your strategy, how you're going to measure that, both what you're trying to achieve and then the secondary impacts of it. And then finally, it's important to plan for accountability. A lot of the advocacy we do in international development is trying to get the government to act. But it's also important that once they've made a commitment that we're holding them accountable and that we're tracking and tracing what is being done and that it's being done in a way that is going to have the best impact and not have any negative results. So I'm going to dive into just a few pieces of advocacy generally and what it is that I think are really important for you to take away and that will be really effective at improving your skills. So one is the targets. This one can be a little confusing sometimes. Targets typically in advocacy are the decision makers that are going to have impact on the issue that you're advocating for. Traditionally, that would be, say, perhaps the Prime Minister, a Minister of International Development or Health, if we're talking about the SDGs, but SDGs, as we know, are universal, so it could be a variety of ministers. Parliamentarians, public servants. It can also be, you might have an advocacy strategy aimed at the private sector or a multilateral organization. So here at Results Canada, we also do advocacy towards multilaterals, including the World Bank, who do have a big impact on global development. Now, sometimes there's a bit of confusion around decision makers and influencers. So influencers are the people or the vehicles that can influence your decision makers. So this could include, for example, the media, public figures like public intellectuals, influential organizations, celebrities, constituents. I just want to emphasize how much influence you do have as a constituent, whether it's your counselor at a more local level or your member of parliament at a higher level. Special interest groups, the public, and then you, just you as a concerned person do have influence. So decision makers can also be effective influencers. So say you have a strategy that you want Global Affairs Canada to put more funding towards Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance for right now, for example, that's something that we're pushing for. You can use parliamentarians as influencers to help influence the decision of a minister, for example. We also saw this can work. I don't know if you guys followed Lady Gaga recently tweeted at Prime Minister Trudeau to tell him to fund Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance. So that's an example of using an influencer to try to have encourage decision makers to take a step. So that's that. Just want to also speak on the ask. This is oftentimes the trickiest part of honestly building an advocacy strategy is getting your ask right. So the ask is who, so which specific decision maker or key stakeholder do you want to take action? What action should that decision maker take? What is the time frame for that action to occur? And then why? How will this help you achieve your ultimate goal? So you might have different asks for your different targets, and that's fine because different people will have different influence over your ultimate objective. But as long as you keep in mind what that ultimate objective is and you're specific enough with the people that you're asking to do something that it's within their power to do and that it will have influence, then you'll be successful. So we often talk about SMART asks, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but it is very helpful. And that just is thinking through, is my ask specific enough? Can I measure it? Going back to the monitoring and evaluation piece. Is it achievable? Is it realistic? As much as, we would love, say, the Canadian government to put, I don't know, 10 billion in development right now, maybe, or whatever it is, that might not be achievable. Is it relevant? And then is it timed? So is it a time frame that's realistic? I also want to touch on the tactics. Now, this is the really fun part of advocacy. I think as advocates, sometimes we can get really excited about the tactics. So this is all about how are you going to get your message, so the ask, to the decision makers, influencers, allies, or partners that you've identified. So this is kind of the activities or the activities of the advocacy strategy. So these might include meetings with decision makers. You'd be surprised, decision makers will take your meetings. If you're clear on what the purpose is, then I would reach out to them. Op-eds, so opinion pieces in newspapers, letters to the editor, articles in the media. We found at Results Canada, this government is very responsive and sensitive to media coverage, so that's always a good tactic. Social media outreach, increasingly decision makers are engaging in social media, and it's a good space to do outreach to them. We are going to have a full workshop on digital communications, so I encourage you to join that. Workshops and conferences, position papers, briefing documents, stunts. These are all ways that tactics that can help you achieve your aims. So when I think things to think about when you're talking about tactics and going through is what kind of resources, capacity, and skills do you have that we all can't do everything. So really focusing on where do you have value add and what tactics make sense for you and the people that you're working with. And then also, who can you bring in the fold to augment the above? So, you know, sometimes I think planning an event at Parliament to raise awareness to this issue is really important, but we just don't have a budget for it. Well, you know what, there's probably another organization or another people that might also be interested in doing that. So it's kind of thinking, who can you loop in? Or I want to hold a stunt at Parliament, but I don't want to go by myself. I want to, you know, hold some signs and do whatnot. You know, reaching out to others that might think similarly is a really important tactic. I think it's only limited by your imagination. I would say that when you're thinking about tactics, the messenger is often as important as the message. So going back to the influencers, who has the most legitimacy? You as a constituent, for example, have a lot of legitimacy and reaching out for a member of parliament meeting. But what we do sometimes, for example, at Results is also thinking through how can we bring the people that have a first-hand knowledge of the issue we're talking about, or can really speak from the heart and from experience on it. So for example, bringing expert visitors to come speak. So we recently were engaging around virtually because of COVID, but engaging with a doctor from Nigeria who was able to speak very eloquently on her experience doing immunization work, which is more powerful than it would have been if it was just me trying to tell her story. So that's something to think through. Just wanted to touch on very quickly, opinion pieces, op-eds, and letters to the editor are something we really emphasize at Results Canada, and that's because it works. There was a study done at Yale in 2018 which showed that op-eds were able to change the opinion of people that read it by up to 15 to 20%, which is pretty incredible. So just, it's something to invest a little bit of practice in, and we have some resources on it. I just wanted to touch on before we go into questions. I know a lot of people are wondering how advocacy has changed with the unique and somewhat frightening times that we're living in, which is COVID. And since I know many of you have interest in being on this webinar, in particular on the Sustainable Development Goals as well as global development, this is kind of from an international perspective, but I think the lessons are relevant to others as well. What we know is that governments are very focused on domestic COVID responses right now. That's Canada's included in that. There's a real worry that budgets are going to be crunched globally and resources are likely diverted. So we're seeing that in some development programs where resources that were typically used for things, for example, immunization or nutrition, are being diverted to respond to COVID, which is necessary in countries where health budgets are already strapped. Domestic polling has not been positive on international efforts, and that's something that the Canadian government has been following. That might shift as Canada gets the pandemic under control, and people might be more open to international support, but just as a flag. Parliament has also gone virtual. We have seen that MPs have been a little less responsive. They've been quite busy in their engagement. And then there's always the worry that we don't want to be tone deaf in terms of how we're broaching issues when we know that people have a lot of stress and a lot going on at home in their personal lives and their work lives. But nonetheless, we know that poorer countries and people that are living in poverty are facing a lot of hardships and are going to be negatively impacted by this virus, even more so than many of us in Canada. So it's really important, and we believe, to continue to take action. So what can we do around that? These are some of the things that we've been engaging on. So one is being a voice of global solidarity. So that means raising awareness of what is happening in low and middle income countries and elevating their voices so Canadians can get a glimpse at what's going on and how they can help. It's also about how to create a supportive environment for global action by governments. So the Canadian government is looking to Canadians and what they want to see happen, and the more letters to the editor that are written, opinion pieces, support on social media, which can be a terrible negative place, all encourages them to make those commitments to having a response that doesn't leave people in poorer countries behind. Gather a group and meeting your MP virtually. We've seen success with this. We have volunteers that the results that have had Zoom meetings with their MPs, and though it might take a little more time to arrange than usual, it's still happening and is a fantastic way to touch base. And then what you guys are all doing now. So building your advocacy skills, taking the time to educate yourself on the issues, and preparing to engage in advocacy, and using all the tactics that we can once this is over. And then just being kind to yourself and each other, because it is a stressful situation. And as an advocacy in global development, you're seeing kind of a lot of negativity and a lot of worry. And just, I think it's important to do that. So you can learn more. We have a bit of a COVID hub on the Results Canada webpage if you're interested in that. So I'm going to stop here, and we're going to have a little bit of time for questions before we hear a case study and from our guest speakers. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing. You can put your questions in the chat box, or you can just wave or raise your hand if you have one as well. This is also the time if you want to stretch or eat, feel free to.
And maybe I'll just jump in as
Sure.
well. I've seen a lot of questions around logistics. Just to remind you, if you were a little bit later into the session, we will be sharing the recording for this. You will also be receiving a workbook where your homework will be shared, but also it'll include a bunch of links that Taryn is referencing, like the op-eds and different resources that Results has. Would you like to share anything else, Taryn, around that?
Yeah, so I would say, as I mentioned, you're going to get a recording of this webinar, the PowerPoint of the webinar, a workbook, which we'll build on in each week, so you can add the pages to it. But then just, yes, the Results website itself has tons of resources. If you're interested in diving into how to write an op-ed or how to do a letter to the editor or how Parliament works, we have lots of info on the website itself. Okay, one of the questions is, what is the big challenge about advocacy? And I might ask, does one of my team members would like to answer that? Kenneth or Robin? I'll jump in. I mean, honestly, working in international development, I think the biggest challenge is always how do you convince decision makers to push for global issues that sometimes it's hard to make the case for a local impact. I think COVID has brought home this to a lot of people, that the world is very interconnected, and that the things that happen abroad impact us up at home. But I do think that has often been a big challenge in advocacy, is building that case. And that's why I'm excited we're going to hear from a former parliamentarian in a little bit who might have some wisdom on that for us.
Sure, and I can jump in as well. Hi, I'm Robin with Results Canada. It's really important, I think, always to build community and have diversity of voice when you're advocating on a different issue. Something that I find challenging sometimes is convincing or demonstrating the value to diverse stakeholder groups that they should be engaging in advocacy, and then trying to convene those stakeholders around acting in the interest of a common or shared goal. And that's just because a lot of people have a lot of work on their plate already. So if you think about researchers, they're focused on in their academic bubble all the time and don't necessarily see how they can translate their research for advocacy purposes. And if they're not supported to take easy, quick action, sometimes it doesn't happen. So that can be a challenge, but there are tactics and ways that you can work around that and really build and strengthen different communities of advocates.
Thank you, Robin. That's great. A couple more questions. How can someone just beginning in advocacy find ways to navigate it? I think that if you're interested in international development advocacy, I would do a plug for Results Canada, because that's kind of our ethos is helping people get into advocacy, and we really do see that it works, and you're going to see that in a little bit. But regardless of what the issue that you're working on, I think the first thing to do is just give it a shot. If you hear about an issue you care about, just try to, for example, write a letter to the editor about it, sign that petition. You can also, I would say, the other thing is pretty much every issue has an organization or a group of community that's working on it. So if you care really strongly about environmental issues, for example, there are going to be those communities that you can engage with, and they can get you started. So I think it's finding people to work with, not overthinking it, and just starting to take action and building your confidence there are kind of the main things. Regarding the tactics, are there some that work better with certain issues than others? Yeah, I think so. I think you have to have a whole arsenal of tactics to create change on the big things. What we found is that honestly, the most impactful way to convince a decision maker to do something is to meet them in person. That's not to say the other ones don't matter at all. Of course they do, but overwhelmingly people, when they have that even virtual, I am including virtual in this, but that face-to-face contact, that's how you can make change happen. So I would say if you're looking at what you can do that's going to have the most impact, that's one of them. I think if it's something, media can also be a really strong tactic, particularly if it's an issue that's controversial, or that you know that you can get more Canadians engaged in. That can be really helpful. Lots of questions coming in. We'll do a couple more questions, and we can also save these for the end because I know we have the speakers coming. Okay, so some of these I think our speakers can answer, so I'm going to save them. Oh, what are some strategies that our team has used to clearly communicate and break down complex issues? Honestly, this is something we're always working at. You get a lot of technical reports in development. These issues are complex. That's the thing. They're not simple. How do you ensure you know, that no child is malnourished? That's a complex issue. I think the biggest thing is three things I would say. One is finding the story. Stories can really help distill a complex issue down into how it's impacting a person. So talking to people that are affected by that issue, learning about their story and telling it with their consent and their input is one of the ways that we've found is very effective on doing that. The same thing with videos, like, you know, the videos that can distill things into a way that people can understand. And that all comes down to plain speaking. So it's using language that people understand. If you know, running things by somebody that you know that is not has no connection with the issue you're working on is a good way to do that, whether it's a partner, you know, a parent or whatnot, and they can tell you if this makes sense to you. And I often do that if I'm working on something. I'll run it by my partner, who's like an economist and only knows numbers, and be like, do you understand this? And if he does, then I know, okay, most people will understand this then. So I'm going to pause here, but please keep your questions coming because we'll have time to answer them. And if not, we can also do that via email. But I want to pass it over to our executive director, Chris Dendys, who's going to give you guys a case study, which is going to help kind of show some of the work we do and the impact that it has.
Thanks,
so I will
Taryn.
share the screen for you, and then just tell me when you want to switch sides.
Sure. Thanks, Taryn, and just a big thank you to all of you beautiful, amazing people who are giving up your lunch hour to learn more about advocacy, and my presumption is advocacy for a better world, for whether it's grassroots to global. So thank you. It's awesome to be here, and it's awesome to be a part of all of you. Maybe first slide, Taryn. So I'm going to just spend, you know, a few minutes, because we've got some much more interesting people after me to speak, about one case study of some work that Results has been engaged with. Results has been around for 30 years and has been involved in lots of winning advocacy campaigns. So there was many that we could choose from, but thought we would pick this one. This is in relation to when Canada hosted the last G7 meeting, which was in Charlevoix, Quebec in 2018. And so in many of the things that Taryn has just really articulately described to you about what goes into a winning advocacy campaign, or how we think about advocacy, I think that this campaign really brings a lot of those things together. And in addition, I would say that I'm going to talk about this for about 5 minutes. It was a campaign that went on for about a year and a half, if not more, in terms of situating and making sure that we were successful ultimately. And so we have a whole other hour long webinar just about the advocacy tactics, tools, strategy that went into this one that we're happy to share with you as part of the resources afterwards as well. But so what this is about, maybe just go back for a sec, Taryn. So the Charlevoix G7 was about identifying, first of all, the opportunity that Canada was going to host the world, that the Prime Minister was going to bring world leaders who are involved with the G7 to Canada in 2018, and recognizing that well in advance, a year and a half in advance, a group of civil society partners coming together and recognizing that G7s are an opportunity to move an agenda item forward that matters, particularly in the development agenda. Next slide. So next slide. So about, I don't know, even more than a year ahead of it, back to the girls, more than a year ahead of it, we came together and we identified if Canada's hosting the G7, what is the opportunity for moving progress or moving an issue forward? And we hit on education, educating girls particularly in emergencies for a number of reasons. And this was after a lot of discussion about what we could be pitching, but really we picked this one, and I think always in our work, we pick campaigns that we, first of all, can have impact in the world that really matter, that there's a need and that we know that we can make a difference on. And in this case, you know, 263 million children and adolescents were out of school. Disproportionately, the number of those that live in countries marked by instability and conflict was massive. Girls are 2.5 times more likely not to be in school than boys. There was lots of reasons in terms of need, and also just recognizing the opportunity of what we call this youth bulge, where 9 out of half of the world, more young people in the world now than ever before. So by tapping into education as an opportunity and unleashing their potential, we could not only change their lives, or they could not only change their lives, but they could change the world. And so that's why we hit on this. Next slide. And so we came up with sort of a long-term road to Charlevoix that began, as I said, a year in advance, where we were thinking about defining the ask, which Taryn had articulated is all central and all important. And so when we came together, we developed an ask that was related to impact in the world. What do we want to achieve? What would winning look like? And through some evidence and working with global partners and figuring out sort of the amount of money it would take to have tangible impact and results, we came up with an ask of $1.3 billion, which we thought was reasonable for a G7 whose collective GDP is more like 34 trillion, but $1.3 billion, which we thought could educate, that had a tangible sort of outreach in terms of the number of girls that could be reached. And of Canada, we wanted $500 million. We wanted $500 million in new and additional funding to this campaign. So we had our ask, we had our need, we had the opportunity, and then we got to work on thinking about how we pushed that agenda forward, how we got in their face, how we made it real. And so typically with lots of advocacy campaigns, that involves both an inside approach and an inside-outside advocacy, which just means as much time as you spend outside pushing hard for change from civil society, from grassroots, from a number of people who care, you could also be working the inside corridors of power to influence and make a difference as well. And this picture is just of our having met with the Prime Minister's office. Katie Telford is the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and there's a number of sort of EDs of different organizations that came together around the specificity of this campaign and the core of it. And that was when we initially made the pitch of what I call a gift, which is, here's the gift to the Government of Canada. The Prime Minister is the Minister of Youth. He cares about young people. He's a former teacher. There is a gift here in terms of providing an opportunity for impact in the world that also meshed with Canada's priorities as wanting to be seen as a leader, as caring about the feminist agenda, all of those sorts of pieces. So this is just emblematic of us coming together and making the pitch and getting somebody lit up by telling stories and making the case. Next slide, please. And then this is a picture I love because along the way, so this is all of the pictures and images I'm showing are about the 8 months in the lead up. The heavy lift of developing the ask came before about that, but the 8 months in the lead up to the actual Charlevoix summit, which took place in the summer of 2018, we did a number of things, what I call lining up the dominoes, inside, outside opportunities to really push the agenda forward. And in this case, the big domino that we lined up was we held a national conference in Ottawa, and all of those amazing, wonderful people are grassroots volunteers with results. We hold these conferences every 2 years. And what you're seeing in this picture is an image of us on Parliament Hill having just met with, I don't know, 50 or 60 odd members of Parliament to really pitch to them the idea of Canada can be a leader on girls' education and they should be pushing forward that agenda at the G7 summit. Next slide. Additionally, on the way, we saw opportunities specific to the G7 where Canada would be hosting ministerial meetings. And this is one that I wanted to share with you just very quickly, which is in Whistler, the development minister hosted a meeting, and the group that you saw earlier, civil society, came together to really push for a declaration supporting adolescent girls' well-being, health, and access to education. Again, another domino at that summit. And so these girls are young women from around the world, nothing about us without us, that went to Whistler and had an hour-long session with development ministers from around the world to speak with their own voice about the importance of issues that they care about, education being a prominent one, and building that case among G7 globally, in addition to G7, the development minister in Canada. Next slide. And this is just more images from that. I had an opportunity to be at this meeting and to be in the room, and those women and those young girls were the most powerful advocates I've ever seen. The conversation with development ministers went well beyond the hour that was slated for it. So just to say, again, truth and reality and speaking with power and authenticity really matters in any campaign. Next slide, please. Additionally, as Taryn was talking about other tactics, this is an example of a petition that was generated by a young woman named Fatuma, whose experience was having grown up in a Somalian refugee camp and was studying as a University of Toronto student, and started this petition, which generated a couple of 100,000 signatures by the time it had run its course. But it was a really powerful putting a person to the reality of the difference that education makes in terms of opportunity. Next slide. And on the hooks of that petition, and because of it, because we had our ask, and because we had rallied, and because we were ready, we also did some media work. And so this is a press conference with CEOs of a number of different organizations with Fatuma's petition really trying to get in the face of media and politicians through the media lens. Next slide, please. But while we were doing those high-level press conferences, our volunteers across Canada were writing letters to the editor, and this is just a cross-section of them, and opinion pieces, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of those, which we would then, once they're published, the great thing about a letter to the editor is then you amplify them, you give them wings, and you share them with your MPs. And once something is published, it has more power and influence, but that was also like a steady drumbeat of activity that was also happening in the background that was really exciting. Next slide, almost done. Finally, we got to the G7 meeting in Charlevoix. A number of us were there. We knew in advance that this was going to happen and that it was going to be a significant investment. And in fact, it was. Next slide. So what we ended up with after rallying, not only in Canada, but also globally, because the other thing I just wanted to say, this was a grassroots to global campaign. So while we were doing our work in Canada, we had civil society partners in other G7 countries doing the work there. So we ended up with a $3.8 billion global investment, 400 million of it from Canada. 50% of it was new to the ODA envelope, which meant that 8.5 million more girls and boys living in most fragile contexts around the world will receive an education. Next slide. And then this was our thank you. I think one of the things in terms of best tips is also to acknowledge when you have a win, not only for yourselves and for your partners and for being a part of that win, but to acknowledge that hope breeds more opportunity for hope and other wins. So thank you very much. That's my case study, and now I'm going to hand it off ably, I think, to others, including Taryn.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I hope that really kind of drove home for people what an advocacy strategy and that building that community can accomplish and how that happens. I think it's also a lesson that advocacy can take a long time and it doesn't happen overnight, and that sometimes it's really built up to have fantastic impact. later on. So now we're really excited to bring some unique perspectives from some expert advocates we have for you today. So we're going to hear from three people today, starting with Rochelle to gain a variety of different perspectives. So Rochelle is a longtime leader in the Results family. She's been a fantastic volunteer over the years and has a wealth of experience in advocacy, and is also a OCIC board member. So I will pass it on to you, Rochelle.
Hi, thanks Taryn, and thanks Chris, and thanks OCIC and everybody that's here right now. Just to let you know, I have been volunteering with Results Canada for 11 years now, and I can't tell you the number of MPs that I have spoken to in person and written to, and letters to editor that I've written and haven't gotten published, but are still very important to send out there. I was asked to talk from a grassroots perspective, what it means to be like a citizen advocate. And I think like a lot of people on this call, I'm gonna guess many of you outside of your work, you volunteer, like you've been volunteering for years. I've been volunteering since I was a teenager in all sorts of causes, you know, because I wanted to do good. I wanted to fundraise for the United Way, for cancer research, you know, to help. I even volunteered overseas like with World University Service of Canada and VSO Canada, because I really wanted to make a difference in the world. But it was interesting because it wasn't until I joined Results Canada and became a volunteer advocate that I realized I wasn't just, you know, doing good. I could use my voice and the power of me to actually contribute to systemic change, you know, to address the social inequities and disparities that existed, and that kind of drew me to volunteering in the first place, you know. It was kind of an interesting thing for me to learn, and also there was a lot of fear on my part, I have to admit, because now I was going to put myself out there as me, not just, you know, doing a task that the organization needed, you know, that was useful and helpful, but still that I was going to stand up, and that my small actions, you know, by lending my voice to a movement and also creating space so that other people could participate in the movement, was actually going to contribute to the changes that I wanted to see in the world. That we could create a world that's free of oppression, and where we could actually end poverty. I won't lie to you, as you've heard, advocacy is hard work. It's long term. It involves not just writing to an MP once. It's you know, it's many times. It's putting all those pieces together, because all of it is about establishing relationships. You know, establishing relationships with people who make decisions, who have the power to make decisions, establishing relationships with like influencers, like Taryn said, by writing to editors. It's funny, the Toronto Star kind of knows my name already, so they just plop it, my op-eds in, or my letters to editor in, you know, and also doing that with people who may not necessarily agree with you. That's kind of a hard thing too, you know. There are different points of view and political perspectives, and you want to reach out to everyone, and that is hard work. If you want to make change happen, you have to think about like laying the foundations and the groundwork for when you can take advantage of that particular moment. You know, and I like to say, you know, just think about in your daily lives, all relationships, no matter what relationship you're in, it's always going to be hard work. It's always going to be a give and take. But, you know, as anybody who's been in any long-term relationship knows that, you know, once you're united in a common goal, it gets easier. The advocacy work does get easier because you're sharing the load now. And even if you sometimes disagree on how to get to that goal, you have a common you have a common goal. So as results, I've been part of a lot of successful advocacy campaigns. And you get really excited about things like the G7 summit in 2018. But the one I'm thinking about in particular was World AIDS Day 2013, when during our national conference on the Hill, then Minister of International Development, Christian Parady, he called 70 of us into a room. And then he said he was going to make this big announcement, $650 million to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Now, the interesting thing was, we understand it's a political game. It wasn't new money, and it was short of the $720 million that we had actually asked for. But it did represent a 20% increase over what Canada had actually given before. And you have to remember, this is a party that's sometimes ideologically averse to foreign aid and international development. So in a way, it was a win. So I think it's important to remember that advocacy is like a marathon and not a sprint. You're going to have successes, and you might have shortfalls, but all of those things are things that you can build upon for your next advocacy campaign. Because don't forget, governments are always changing. Our global context or the context of your communities will change and evolve for all sorts of reasons, and there's always going to be some opportunity that you can take advantage of. But the most important thing I think to remember is that your voice counts. It's the power of you speaking out passionately. A lot of people, I saw a question about, well, what if you don't know about the issues and stuff? You can learn. And you can also find out who else has the expertise that you can invite along. Because it's not just about, as Taryn said, you speaking on behalf of others. It's about, being part of a larger connected community that has common goals that you can be a part of. Your voice counts. Your MP works for you. And most news outlets, exist to disseminate information that is supposed to serve the public interest. All our democratic institutions are tools that to make systemic change happen, but it's our choice to use them and, to engage. It can be a little bit scary sometimes, but if you take that step, great things can happen. So I just want to end on this with this quote from Senator Robert Kennedy from 1968. I have to add person because he did speak about man and we want to be more inclusive. But he said, each time a person stands up for an ideal, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. To me, that's the power of advocacy, and I invite each one of you to start your own ripple. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. That was amazing. And I think there's some great lessons in there that I know we will all take to heart. So next we have Amanda Sussman here with us. So Amanda is a formidable advocate, strategist, and also the author of The Art of the Possible, which if you have not read is a really great book that goes in the ins and outs of advocacy. So I'll let you go, Amanda.
To see this much energy.
Oh, sorry, you were muted. You were muted. I muted you now. You're good now.
I'm good now. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here, and it's so great to see such energy and activism and advocacy still, and how absolutely we need this energy more than ever. And we're so happy to have so many people still continuing to join the fight. I was listening to what Rochelle said, and I think I would start with just this bigger theme of a personal choice you really need to make, and you need to maybe continually make it all the way through your journey. And I talk about this for many years now, but the longer I'm in this game, the longer I see how valid it is, which is you need to ask yourself, Am I a radical or am I a reformer? And you absolutely need both kind of approaches to achieve social change, because the radicals are pushing for very systemic changes at the foundation to push decision makers farther than they're willing to go. But then you also need reformers who are working inside the parameters of what's possible within the current political context, with the current personalities, with the current decision-making environment, to push it as far as they can go. So I talk about a sandwich approach where you have activists outside calling for the impossible, but raising the bar extremely high. And then you have people on the inside figuring out the nuances of policy, where the budget lines are coming from, what the competing priorities are, and making a very realistic and feasible ask that's as far as the government can possibly push with that decision. But the reason I say it's a personal choice is because often people have, without knowing it, different expectations of what looks like success to them. And more than anything else, I've seen this kill motivation early on. And look, everybody's doing this off the side of their desk. You're all volunteers. And if you're not really clear on that for yourself, you may be continually disappointed. On the flip side, if you are really clear about that, for instance, if you're a reformer and you can celebrate every step along the way, that's a success. Because as Chris, I can't tell you, she's probably the most powerful advocate in the country. She talks about lining up the dominoes, and it's absolutely lining up the dominoes. It may seem like this was just one meeting, but in that meeting, we had a realistic ask, meaning we went into that meeting with something that was within that person's power and that they could deliver on it. So if you're meeting with the person at the bottom of the food chain, your ask may be, can you raise this with your boss? And then that person can respond and say, yes, I can, or no, I can do it in a month, but not now. But that idea of being really clear in how you want to work and what your expectations are of success is really fundamental to sustaining your motivation over the long term. But as Rochelle said also, it's very messy, because often within our sectors, and the hardest pressures I've found are in fact internally, because there's an ongoing tension between those two approaches. Because in some cases, those pursuing the radical approach can feel like the reformers are actually undermining their efforts because they're putting something much lower, a much lower bar on the table as acceptable. And that can be really, really hard. And throughout the years, Chris, Taryn, many of us have seen that tension play out over and over again, without kind of that broader strategic framing of we're trying to push from both the outside and the inside to get that kind of as far as it possibly can at that particular moment. And I'll give you an example of this. And I do talk through this because I think people have to see it in real time. When we were working on the Muskoka initiative, and I don't know if this example's come up today or not, Chris? No, okay. So there was a group within the CCIC coalition that put forward maternal, newborn, and child health to be the signature issue of the G7, the G8 at the time, when Harper was Prime Minister in 2010. And originally, there was quite a broad coalition putting forward this as front and center. And then, as we know, midway through the process, Harper announced that, yes, he would pick up this topic that we had been proposing, but not include sexual reproductive health and rights. And it really caused a very real tension within the sector between, there was one camp that said, oh, we have to pull our support. And if he's not going to include that, absolutely, that it's a fundamental part of women and children's health. And we need to pull the plug and not get behind this. And then there was a group that said, no, in fact, the decision hasn't yet gone to cabinet. We're on the verge of getting billions of dollars for the main reasons women and children are dying in the developing world: pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, things we know how to solve. Do we pull the plug on the whole thing because it doesn't have everything? Or do we take what we can get now, wait for an election, and continue to build on it? And that's the decision that we had to make. And so the coalition did in fact split, and it caused a lot of tension that lasted for, I would say, many years, and it's still going on today. But when I look back at it, I would say it's actually a healthy tension in activism, because that push with groups saying, no, it's not enough, and this is a flawed initiative, was absolutely valid. They were 100% right, and it created space and it created pressure for when the election did change to go back in and say, well, look, Canada's approach on maternal, newborn, and child health needs to add sexual reproductive health and rights, which we were then able to achieve with the Feminist International Assistance Policy once we had a new minister. So there's a long game you're playing, but also a short-term game. And it's really, I think, important to be clear with yourself which one you're pursuing. So then also you can say, well, I made this choice for this reason. I was certainly one of the ones in that camp that said we have to stay in the game. If we pull the plug now, look at what we're turning our back to in terms of diarrhea, malaria, pneumonia, all things. The job is huge, and we can't do it all at once. We have to work a bit at the time. But I feel I can stand on solid ground and have a really clear decision, or a clear rationale for why I made that decision, and also view the decision of others as equally valid. So I point that out. My second thing that I would say after so many years, and I repeat this over and over, is celebrate the small successes. Because so often advocates, their bar for what success looks like is absolutely transformational at the highest level. And again, this is where I see people dropping like flies, right? It is about the dominoes, and actually these smaller decisions can fundamentally, sometimes it is as small as you're working with the pen and the department at the lowest level of the hierarchy, and you got them to insert your wording in the memo that's going up to the minister for decision. That can be a fundamental victory. It can actually get the issue right there because it's included in the decision-making process at the outset. So it may seem like, oh, I met with the most junior person and they agreed with me, but in fact, that's a transformational impact because it became a core piece of the decision that was undertaken. And I say this from experience because I had spent years as an activist with Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and Greenpeace, and then I was on the receiving end in the minister's office for about 6 years. And I had a bird's eye view of what effective advocacy looked like. And I can say without a doubt that it is about the dominoes laddering up. And I could see influencing points all the way through the decision-making process. And that's where I saw a real imbalance. I've talked about the radical approach being entirely valid and necessary, but what I saw was too many taking the radical approach and far too few taking the reformer approach. And what I mean by that is on certain big decisions that I saw go through, one of them was around detention without charge after September 11th. We had, now I'm speaking in the immigration and refugee space, we had a strong coalition that rightly so was campaigning there should never be detention without charge. However, what was happening within the security establishment in government is their mandate was to say, how can we prevent a next 9/11? And none of the alleged terrorists had criminal records. So the discussion on the inside was so far down that road. And what was missing in the middle is, how do we put safeguards around this from a civil liberties perspective? What are the checks and balances? What are the courts of appeal? There was literally no discussion in that middle space because we had the entire sector take, we're not even going in to negotiate with you. And then the security establishment on the one side. So I looked at that as, that worried me considerably. That's one of the things I still lose sleep over, which is what motivated me actually to write The Art of the Possible, to encourage more people to take the reformer approach and in fact be proud of it. Because once we start having, I did start to reach out to people in that middle space who actually weren't necessarily out there publicly saying so, but give me a list of policy recommendations that would put a very robust safeguards around this, checks and balances around this. So at minimal, if this decision is so far out of the gate and the powerful agencies of government are going down that road, there is this whole area of protections on the table alongside it. So I'll stop there and I'll say again, thank you. And it can be, I would say, the most rewarding career path you could ever take, whether it's your main job, whether it's on the side, it absolutely is. If you take the time to celebrate those small successes, they do ladder up. The dominoes do ladder up, and look what we've achieved. Both G7s in Canada, it's a pretty amazing record.
Thank you, Amanda. That's a lot of great wisdom and a lot of enthusiasm on the chat for the Celebrate the Small Successes. So fantastic. Last but not least, we're really excited to have Libby Davies here. Some of you may already know her. She's an activist, a politician, former member of parliament, and also an author, recently published Outside In, a political memoir. So we're going to link to the resources, including these books, that I would really encourage you to check out in the worksheet. So without further ado, I'll pass it along.
Watch on for 5 minutes so I don't go over time. So you might hear it ding off. It's very wonderful to be on this webinar. I'm here in Vancouver on the West Coast. So thank you to Results Canada and OCIC for hosting everybody today. And I can see all the faces, and this is what we do now, right? We do it virtually. So yes, let's talk about advocacy. My own background is that I began as a community organizer, I guess an advocate, way back in the 70s in Vancouver's inner city, the downtown east side. And I learned very early that advocacy and campaigning are best buddies. You can't really have one without the other. I guess theoretically you can be an advocate on your own. You can do your own thing, but when you're part of a network, when you're part of a movement, when you're part of a campaign, that's when advocacy really starts to take off. For me, advocacy is critical to bringing about transformative change. And I learned this later when I became a member of parliament for 18 years. And I began to understand what advocacy looked like both from the outside and from the inside, because I had people lobbying me all the time, advocating to me as a member of parliament, but of course I'd also been involved as an advocate myself. So I always understood, and I think both Rochelle and Amanda have made this point, that advocacy is critical to how we bring about transformative change. Advocacy is not about just sort of dumping information on people. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that I've been lobbied and people thought they were advocating, and basically what they did was show up, dump a whole bunch of material on me that, you know, maybe I would or wouldn't read, and that was the end of it. To me, advocacy is about a two-way street. It is about sustained activity. It is about sustained action. It is, as Rochelle said, about building relationships, both on the inside and the outside. So advocacy isn't just about activists trying to pressure government to change something or decision makers trying to change something. Advocacy is about finding relationships on the inside and the outside, because elected people need the advocates as well. It is a two-way street in terms of finding ways to work together, to learn together, and to bring about change. Now, Amanda, I really appreciated your comments about working for reform versus being radical. And I suppose I would see myself maybe a bit more on the radical side, but I feel like I've always been able to work for pragmatic things as well. And so I've never seen them as mutually exclusive. I had this idea in my head about thinking big, knowing connected in our world, the issues or big ideas, sometimes impossible, radical ideas, but acting in a way that is manageable and in a way that you're bringing people with you. I remember very well when Canada hosted the G8 or whatever it was, and the whole debate around maternal health and reproductive rights. I was an MP at the time, and I remember the tension, of course, within Parliament itself. And what I would say is that, you know, can we find ways to adhere to our principles and to say, yes, we advocate for reproductive rights, but we also know we can work on these other levels too. Is there a way in some instances, not all instances, to actually bring these things together so that we don't feel that we've let go of the bigger principles that we have? So the idea of thinking big, but acting small, acting in ways that we can actually bring about change, I think is very important. The other thing that I've learned about is that, you know, it's very easy for us within communities that we know and with allies that we know. And I think when we want to bring about transformative change, the idea of looking for unlikely allies, allies that might surprise the decision makers that you're trying to influence. So to give you an example, I worked for a long time on trying to set up safe consumption sites for injection drug users, not just in Vancouver, but across the country. And one of the transformative points was certainly people who use drugs speaking out themselves, but also to find unlikely allies, to be a voice of solidarity, to be a voice of support. And so having unlikely allies, whether they were in the scientific community, middle-class parents whose kids were dying of heroin overdoses. And so sort of changing the lens, changing the view of what the advocates look like, and bringing in allies to broaden the movement. To me, that's a very important element of advocacy. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I do want to thank you all for the advocacy that you do. And to close on this note, I think the most important thing, and both Rochelle and Amanda referenced this, is we have to be sustained in our actions. You know, we live in this instant world where we expect things, you know, you like something on Facebook and, oh, wow, did it happen? Well, of course not. It is about a sustained action. It is about building these relationships with each other, with our movement, and also with the decision makers. So you've got the champions that you need on the inside, as well as working with the champions that we need on the outside to bring about transformative change. Thanks, Taryn.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting and appreciate your perspective. I'm seeing a lot of silent clapping. So we had a lot of great questions. I think I've been collating them. I think a lot of the questions were answered by some of the speakers, which is great. We're running a little short of time, so what we'll also do is go through them and then make sure that we're integrating them into the future workshops as well. And potentially we can do like a Q&A, even like a living Google Doc that we can update for you guys. But does anybody have a quick final question that wasn't answered that they would want to throw out there? I'm happy to hear one if you want to take yourself off mute.
Yeah.
Ella, is that?
Hi, yes,
Hi.
I just have a hi. So thank you to all the speakers who have been really wonderful information. One question I have is about the whole sustained action. So if we're interested in, let's say, working with youth who's in a space where they're mobile, they're next year may not be in the same space, they may be doing different things. How do we kind of not lose that, not lose those young people when they just in the life stage, they're not at a place where they maybe will provide sustained efforts, but we still want to continue to engage them. So just any advice on that?
Amanda, you raising your hand?
Yeah, I'm raising my hand because I've found over and over again, it goes back to those dominoes, because if during the time that they're involved, there's a small win, no matter how small, and you really do celebrate it, it hooks you for life because you feel like, wow, I had that meeting and it actually made a difference. Now I saw my word raised, I saw my question raised in question period, whatever it was. I find, and that's the only way to really hook someone for the long term, is by a little success. Oh, I took another step forward. Oh, another step forward. Again, so if your expectations are up here and what they did was down here, they may feel like, oh, I'm never going to get there, on to the next thing. Whereas if you break it down into the dominoes, it works. Because once you felt that in your gut, that I really did make a difference with this one action I took, it's addictive.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we'll end it on that. I think that sums up a lot of the power of advocacy and how to keep everybody engaged and keep going. But we gonna share my screen for a second here. Okay, and then I'm just going to give you, what we're going to do here is just give you a really quick sneak peek for next week's session. So I think Robin or Kenneth, we're going to let us know what's coming.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so I think, I'm sorry, my screen is, there we go. So yeah, next week we're going to be talking a bit about how to plan an advocacy strategy. So we're going to be trying to actually think through how do we identify key decision makers, how do we like really concretely make a firm ask that we can share, and then how can we think through some of those tactics and pieces that we're working towards that will actually be able to help us create that effective change. It will be building a little bit on what you've heard this week, and I think will also allow us to flow really well into the coming weeks as well, as we start to look more into the parliamentary work and some digital advocacy, and then eventually our monitoring and evaluation as well.
Perfect.
So looking forward to it.
Thank you. So it's going to be very interactive. Bring your ideas, bring your questions. We're looking forward to seeing you there. I'm going to send, as I mentioned, a worksheet, and I urge you, this is going to be on it. But just in terms of reflection from today's session, if you want to write down if you had one or a few key aha moments or takeaways that you can bring with you going forward from this workshop, and maybe share them with others as well. And then just a little bit of homework, very tiny. I didn't quiz you guys because we ran out of time, but I'll put the quiz on the worksheet. But just this is something we're going to discuss in the kind of introduction breakout rooms next week is, what do you think your strongest advocacy skill is, and what is the skill you're least comfortable with? So that's going to be the discussion. Finally, just want to thank you again on behalf of Results and OCIC. We're so happy you took the time to be here with us today, and hope that you became a little bit more confident about what advocacy is, why it's important, and maybe you're interested in pursuing this path a little more. You can find more information through some of our contact info, but we will be in touch. So just once again, I also want to thank our guest speakers for taking the time to be here with us today. That was such fantastic input, and I know I learned a lot. So thank you.